your committee, and let me greet our delegation. I believe today we are having the ChristianView network. We are having South Africans on the vessel. We are having, I always say S.A.O. We are having South African Human Rights Commission, but I'm told they are going to join us virtually. We are having the Western Cape Commissioner for Children and Child Government Monitors. We are having equal education.
Ex-Mrs. Chairperson, I can't hear anything.
I'm online.
Can you hear me?
Can we check? Can you hear us? No.
Now we can hear you, Chairperson. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Mahada, for confirmation. Thank you. Dr. Megwayo, are you fine?
Yes, I can hear.
All right. No, let's.
But the host keeps on muting me.
Can you repeat?
No, I say the host keeps on muting me, but I can hear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think people must come to Parliament, Pella. We are not going to proceed like, but anyway, from next week, looks like Parliament won't be able to cater our hybrid sessions. So you guys must come to Parliament next week. It's something that we're going to announce anyway. We are using the public protectors space because they are not sitting today. So they are not going to be able to cater for
Chair, we have some issues, Chair. We'll come to Parliament, not that we wanted to stay at home. We
Thank you
didn't want
very much,
We'll
Samantha.
come. Please.
Thank you very much. I know you are very loyal servants. Okay, so I was saying, I think what you missed, we've got a delegation from Uganda that is with us, and they are joining us to just observe what we are doing today. We've got our, should I call you guests, organizations, our guests, which have got an interest. They have indicated that they would want to come and do the oral presentation. And I have mentioned all of them. I think you do have an agenda in front of you. You have seen them, but I've mentioned all of them that are here. So now we are going to start. And as we are going to start with the ChristianView network, which is Mr. P. Rosantha. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. But as for the other stakeholders, what we are going to do, we are going to listen to him. And I'm going to hand over to the members. If they've got some clarifications, they do that. If they don't, once we are done with you, we are moving quickly to the next person. So I'm happy that you are all here because we'll be able to run the process very smooth. And if you are done, Mr. Rosenthal, it's up to you to sit or you can leave if you want to leave. But we are looking at finishing by 1 o'clock. If everything goes well with all the stakeholders, we've got about 9 for today. So we are hoping that we will be done by 1 o'clock. So let me hand over to the members to introduce themselves. And I apologize for all this inconvenience that we have of networks so that we understand who are the members that we are dealing with in the committee.
Thank you, Chairperson, and good morning, colleagues. My name is Suela Elvis, member of the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues, our guests, and also our observers from Uganda. My name is Nombiselo Gladys Adjones. I'm a member of this Portfolio Committee on Basic Education. Thank you, Chair.
Chairperson, once more, thank you very much. Good morning to one and everybody. First, to my fellow honorable members, to our guests, and also to our special guests from Uganda who have come as observers. My name is Ronnie. The surname very complicated and compound, Mura Tseka. That's my surname, and thank you very much.
Good morning to everybody in the organizations that are here today. My name is Bakoli Lenodata. I'm a member of this portfolio committee on basic education.
Morning, Chair and honorable colleagues. I'm Wynand Boshoff, also a member of this portfolio committee, alternative member to be accurate.
Good morning. My name is Renelo Mashavela. I'm the member of this committee. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Honorable Dr. Temekwaye, member of this committee as an alternate. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues, and to our visitors today and our presenters. My name is Desiree van der Walt. I am a member of this portfolio committee and apologize for not being present in person.
Good morning, Chair and everyone in the House, visitors from Uganda. My name is Marina van Zyl and I'm an alternate member of this portfolio committee of basic education. Thank you.
Okay. All right then, thank you very much. Let me hand over to you, Mr. Rosantha.
On a point of before, I don't know, but I thought this is an area we need to address even before we can get started, the time limit. Because there will be people who would be tempted to go beyond 3-4 hours. And then if we talk about it, it will assist us manage our day as a belief. So it's my submission. Thank you.
I think you're all aware that you must present for 15 minutes, right? It's 15 minutes for them to present. And then we also urge you, your questions and your clarifications to be straight to the point so that they respond and then we are done with each presenter. So the allocation is roughly 30 to 40 minutes, but 15 is for presentation. Thank you, Mr. Rosantha.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm Philip Rosenthal from ChristianView Network. And I think, first of all, before we start the detail of this discussion, I think we need to look at, firstly, why this is important to all parents in South Africa and possibly is one of the most important bills that we have looked at over the last decade. It certainly changes the situation for a generation of parents and is the biggest change in education in the last 25 years. Now, I start off with the presupposition that all education assumes a worldview and consequently assumes belief. So consequently, all education is inherently religious. One cannot avoid that. But we have a diverse society and we have different views from different parents about what type of education they would like for their children. We also have a difference between individual children that their needs, their strengths and weaknesses and the way that they might want to be educated or what might be best for them may be different. And we believe that parents are the ones who can best determine that. Now, there are really two different visions for how we solve this problem of the inherent religious nature of education and also the difference and the diversity in our society. The one solution, could I have the next slide, is that the state should decide. The other solution is that parents should decide for each child through the mechanisms that are devolved through the Constitution, through the Schools Act, and the options that are available to them in public schools, in private schools, and through home education. And then in each of those, through the different options that they have to express their views. Now, could I have the next slide? Sorry, next 2 slides. Duane? Okay. Okay. I can shift to my own. Have you got a problem there that it's not pairing? Okay. Now, I think we've got 3 pieces of guidance in terms of this question of should the state decide or should parents decide. The first piece of guidance is the Bible. Now, every single scripture in the Bible that deals with children gives an instruction to parents on how to look after their children, and it gives an instruction to children to listen to their parents. There's no instruction that gives a mandate to the state to control education. So any mandate that the state has is delegated from parents. And I believe it's really important for every official, every teacher to remember that that mandate comes from God to parents, to them. They don't have that mandate directly from the state. And at every point, everybody who becomes involved in helping children needs to remember their accountability to the parents of those children, unless there is a special situation where the parents are doing something neglectful or criminal. The second guidance that we have is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And this is the only right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights where it says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. That means that the United Nations emphasized that they did not grant this right. That right was there before the United Nations was founded and cannot be taken away. It's a prior right. So we just have to all respect that right that is God-given to parents. Then the Western Cape Constitution helpfully says that the government must adopt policy that allows children to receive basic education in a system of their parents' choice. The National Constitution talks about the best interests of the child being paramount, but if one interprets that through other documents, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one assumes that the parents are the ones who decide what is best for their child and not a one-size-fits-all solution decided by some official in the state. Now, if I could have the next slide, I'd like you to think about the fact that you are all parents, and I'd like to think of you to think about the value that you place on your children and the best future that you want for them. Llewellyn, could I have the next one? And how unhappy you would be if somebody tried to do something to your children in education that you were not happy about. You would be very angry. And I think that that is the situation that we have now in this country. We don't have thousands of parents protesting in the streets, but what we do have, if I could have the next slide, is a protest through the internet where we have had more response on this particular bill than any other bill in the history of South Africa, apart from the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was dealing with 100 different issues, but this really shows that parents care about this issue more than they care about any other issue in South African history. That is why they made so many submissions and they have voiced their concerns so loudly on social media. We have, just for an example, when the Department of Basic Education introduced proposals for sex education in school, within 3 weeks, there was more than 100,000 parents had joined a social media group that was opposed to this particular proposal. So they were not happy with that. And I would ask parliamentarians, you're there to represent your constituents, and constituents have, across a diversity of different groups, really voiced a strong, unanimous statement that they want parents to be the ones who make this decision. Now, when we look at the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, as it was originally proposed, there have thankfully been a number of improvements, which I thank the Department of Education for. The first improvement was that teacher appointments are now with the school governing bodies. We want to keep it that way. Educators don't have to declare their finances, and they can, these governing bodies can verify the ability of parents to pay. Then there's been a relaxation of a number of the provisions that parents were unhappy with. The first one is the leasing of facilities has been relaxed to 1 year. Then the penalty has been relaxed from 6 years to 1 year. We're still not happy with that. We want 0 jail time for parents who may homeschool their parents. Then the home education requirement to make submissions is reduced from annual to each phase. There's a complex process on language policy, and the language has been slightly softened with regard to curriculum. The part which has not been fixed, and I would like to appeal to members of parliament, please, to help to fix these things, is the school governing bodies' control on admissions, which affects their financial viability, it affects their ethos and affects their language, because they need to get a group of people who share a common vision. Not everybody has that same vision, and we can have different schools with different ethoses and methods. Then it also impacts the viability of schools to employ extra teachers to improve those schools. Now, the next provision I'd like to ask you to change, please, is the school governing bodies are at the moment all required to declare all their financial interests and those of their spouses and their children. Now, that is unreasonable, and a lot of parents are going to avoid being on the governing body because they don't want to do that. Just on the left there is an article. It had 6,000 shares, which equates to 1 million views. That was essentially the same submission I'm giving you now in 2017. And I think that really shows parents are interested in this issue. The next issue is that, and I think that in terms of parents being on the governing body, it's sufficient for them to just declare any business that they might have with the school. They shouldn't be doing business with the school if they're on the governing body. Don't have to declare everything. Then the homeschooling, if one removes the requirement for consultants to do assessments, that adds to costs, and people are already sacrificing one income in order to home educate. Then an increased flexibility on alternative curriculums. And then for independent schools, this requirement for subsidies to have quarterly financial statements is onerous and is going to distract them from teaching. I think annual reports are quite sufficient. Now, there's a diversity of reasons, if one can have the next slide, why parents are unhappy with their local school, and many of them are wanting to have a say on their governing bodies, and they are also opting for home education. Could I have the next slide, Lewin? That includes this sexual sin education, pornography, gangs, teen pregnancy, abortion referral, drugs, gender confusion, bullying, woke religion, interfaith religion, the removal of the Bible from schools. And the thing is that somebody might disagree with that, but that's fine. They can have another different school or a cottage school or homeschool where they can have a different alternative. But parents are really concerned about these things and want to have a say. And one cannot make a formula that everybody's going to be happy with. So if I could have the next slide. So the solution is to empower parents through the governing bodies, through homeschooling choice, through respecting parental authority, and to also enable renting of facilities. Not every private school that wants to start up is going to be able to have its own school field. So if they can rent school fields from another school or a swimming pool and have an agreement that is reasonably secure, that is really helpful. Also, the opportunity for startup churches to share school things and input into the school finances. I think that it's going to be much better if there's a 3-year rental period that is allowed rather than a 1-year rental period, because that gives more security to these groups. Then if I could have the next slide. Now, in terms of these options, I've got a photograph here of a parent who was jailed for homeschooling. He was the first parent who took a stand and he said to the apartheid government, no, he didn't want to send his children to the public school. And so they put him in separate jail from his wife and sent the children off to an orphanage. Now, we never want this to happen again. That is Andre and Bokkie Mankies, and they did that for their Christian conviction. So this penalty clause would like to have that distinct, that jail time must be for people who violently intimidate learners to stop them from going to school. It mustn't be for parents who decide to choose homeschooling instead. And a lot of parents are so upset with what is being pushed through the education department, particularly on the sex education issue and on gender issues, that they are not trustful to want to register at the moment. And I think that that is a trust that needs to be rebuilt, but that trust has been very badly damaged. Also, some parents complain of a kind of an assertive bullying approach that they're not happy with. So now, if we go on to the next slide, this proposal would increase the costs of homeschools. They would have to hire consultants, where they're already losing one parent's salary by homeschooling. They're going to have to do a whole lot more paperwork, and it's going to be more costs for the department to process all of these proposals. And they're also going to have less curriculum choice. Now, what I've discovered in researching homeschooling is that a lot of parents, when they start homeschooling, they kind of follow the state curriculum, but then as they go on, they deviate from the curriculum. They find better ways that are more suitable for their child, and they kind of work more towards a project approach rather than what would be mimicked in a classroom environment. But at the end of the day, it has this a similar result to attending school, mostly better. And we've got children that are graduating now into university who've been homeschooled. They're quite fine. They're coping quite okay. And really, they're choosing homeschooling a lot of the time because they want a specific curriculum that they want to follow, which is or approach that is different, and often that is a Christian-based curriculum that they are wanting, but other people choosing other curriculums. Next slide, please. Now, the next issue is the question of language medium. Now, if we remember the anger of the 1976 riots, now, and against the state attempting to impose a language policy, one size fits all on everybody. And so I think we can avoid that by adopting this policy. Next slide. Then there's the tax issues that there are many, next slide, additional costs with this proposal. Llewellyn, next slide, please. Then the question of the security of this data that governing bodies are going to have to put in. I do not believe the education department can keep all of this data secure. It's going to be vulnerable to hackers. The education department could have a poppy class action suit if it is breached by hackers, unless the education department wants to upgrade all the financial infrastructure to protect this data, which is going to cost a whole lot of money. So otherwise, this is going to deter parents from wanting to be on the governing body. And there are also, we would also like, in terms of leases, to shift this from a proposed 1-year maximum lease to a 3-year maximum lease or 6 months notice, which would be much better for the parties involved. Then this billable allows the minister to make more regulations that can further erode. Next slide, please, Llewellyn. It's next several slides. Can erode the authority of parents. And I think we reached a high point under Minister Bengu, and since then it's been going down. Each year there's been more powers taken away from parents, and we would say this is not helpful. The state should concentrate on helping those schools that are struggling and leave the parents that are doing a good job alone to run those schools that are doing well. So this could give the minister a blank check to further erode parents' rights without coming back to Parliament in both home education and in schools. So if I've given the example of Milnerton Beach, if you go and visit there, in Bloberg Beach, every year it's just being eroded back by the sea because of some bad engineering decisions. And we don't want this erosion to carry on with parental rights. We also ask for the financial reports for independent schools would be much more reasonable if you made it quarterly rather than annual. But in all of this detail, I think the principle must be remembered that the parents are the ones who care most about their child, and they need to be empowered and strengthened. And if there are governing bodies that are weak, we want to help them to become stronger, not to take powers away from them. So I thank you for this opportunity, and happy to handle questions. But I would really like to ask you as parliamentarians to think about the value you place on your child, and to empower every other parent in this country to have that power to make decisions for their child.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosenthal. That is the view of the ChristianView network. Those are the clauses they feel that strongly they don't agree with the amendments that the department is proposing to do. Anything from the members' point of clarities? Also.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think previous experience teaches that every member would like to engage. It's a little bit like, I don't know what you call it in English, but the bitty. It takes very long for the first one to stand up and make a prayer, but once somebody started, it doesn't get in time. Well, what I would like to ask from you is, we have this dilemma of having a secular state, in which according to the Constitution, it's actually a religious neutral. And then we have very religious people. And we have to navigate within that. I think it's for many of us a personal but also a public concern. How do we navigate within the secular state as being, in my case, a Christian, in another person's case, another religion? And it has a very strong bearing on education. I think it's one of the most important questions within public schools, which use public money, but it could even become relevant to independent schools, where somebody might argue that because of the secular nature of the state, not even independent education should be allowed to promote a certain religion in school. I think that would be an extreme application of the secular nature of the Constitution. But as we have seen, the real Constitution shifts all the time, while the written Constitution remains unchanged for decades. The real actual Constitution of the country is changing all the time, and it is changing away from religion in schools, where that was fairly standard in the early phase of the present dispensation. Now, the reason why I'm saying all this is I want to ask from the Christian network, how do you envisage, I would like to say us, because I share that Christian value system with you, but let's term it in more general terms. How should religious groups navigate within the secular state? And should one look maybe at even pushing back in order to shift the Constitution in the other way than which has been becoming the norm in the previous years? Thank you, Honorable Chair.
Honorable Skole.
Thank you, Chairperson, and also thank you, the presenter. Well, I listened to you very carefully, and Honorable Boshoff covered me on the issue of the secular state. But then what I would like to know from you, in what way is the Bella Bill taking the right of parents to decide on their children? Because I want to hear that. And secondly, just on the issue of language, are you comfortable with the current situation where language is used to exclude certain groupings within the education system? I just want to hear your view. That. Thank you, Chair.
Honorable Adwins.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. Let me also appreciate the presentation that is it was done. I think I was covered on the issue of the language policy and the clause that seeks to amend it. But maybe before I ask this two specific questions. Firstly, I would want to check if the department is with us, maybe to clarify some of the information that has been presented here, because the first one is that it was not clear which clauses you were referring to. Maybe going forward, members or presenters will also talk into the specific clauses to say clause 1, 2, 3, 4, because there are about 56 clauses that they are seeking to amend the South African Schools Act. So maybe if you can be specific on those clauses. But my second issue is with regard to maybe if I can get the clarity on the registration of homeschooling, you know, if maybe also the department can elaborate more if what will be the penalties if you are not registered and the likes. That will be my second point. The third point, it was on the SGB powers that are being taken or assumed to be taken if the bill pass vis-a-vis the empowerment of SGBs. If also maybe we can get clarity on that. Thank you very much.
Noted. Noted.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. And I listened quite clearly. So obviously, as a member of the committee, dealing with the bill, and knowing what clauses are in the bill, I'll probably ask you very specifics, because some of the things that you've presented here obviously fit in some specific clauses of the bill, so that I can get some clarity as to, based on your presentation, what do you then orally submit to the committee, so that we are all clear. The first one is around the statement made that there's been more powers given to the minister versus those powers being taken away from parents who, as stated, you believe is best suited to decide on the future and education of their children. Now, some of the powers that you've mentioned around the powers taken away from school governing bodies, which are mostly parents that are represented there, and those powers being education and being admissions and language, determining the admissions and language policy. Are you then submitting orally to the committee that, as the ChristianView network, that you believe that the school governing body powers to determine admissions and language should remain with the parents? Or is there an alternative to that? And if that is the case, if you can maybe just elaborate more as to why you believe that. Secondly, there's been a question asked by Honorable Boshoff, which, from my deduction of what you've presented, most of the points that was made was around choice, that parents must be able to choose, despite what their beliefs are. Would that assertion that I make be correct? Despite whether I'm a Christian or not, yes. What you're fighting for is, you know, or what you're presenting to us is that parents must have the ability to choose where they would like to send their children, and not necessarily be told what schooling they will get. And linked with that, there was a point made around homeschooling education, and your proposal here, from my deduction, is that you don't believe that there should be consultants that parents should be forced to kind of get to be able to determine whether the conditions in which they teach their children are correct. What alternative do you then put in place as a proposal to the amendment of the bill itself? If you, as part of your proposal, believe that that will increase costs, because I do think that there needs to be some form of accountability in some way, even though a child is homeschooled, so that we ensure that that child's right to access education is not infringed, but it is monitored. Then the second last one, Chair, there's a point that is critical that you made. Focus on broken schools and not break what works. And in many instances, parents choose schools that are far away from the community. They probably best serve better quality education, or they choose to take their children to those schools because of whatever their reasons are, but they choose to take their children to those schools. And along the way, they skip quite a lot of schools. My parents were one of those people that did that, because the schools that were close by were actually not good enough for what they believed I should get. Now, in saying that, part of your proposal is to say that, you know, fix what's broken. Don't disempower school governing bodies, parents that already are working and doing and making this work, but rather focus your energies in making sure that those schools that are actually being driven past by parents to go look for better schools are actually functional. Now, the proposal that has been put here is that for us to be able to curb that, let's take away some specific powers around admissions and language, and therefore we'll solve the problem. Do you believe that that will solve the problem by taking away those school governing body powers that are from schools that are already functional, away from them, to balance the scale with the schools that are actually not functional in terms of their school governing body powers? Or what alternative proposal would you put in place for us to amend the law to ensure that we uplift those school governing bodies that are actually dysfunctional in schools that parents drive past because they believe they're not adequate, to ensure that we increase the quality, access, and language offering there? The last one, Chair, is also specifically around language. Do you believe that mother tongue education improves the depth of knowledge of a child and the quality of education that they receive? As an example, if I study my maths in Xhosa, as I am, and somebody else may choose to study it in Afrikaans, or someone in Chivenda, language of, you know, whatever mother tongue they are at home, do you believe that there's better depth and better quality of education that they can receive? And should the bill not actually be focusing on building mother tongue education, rather than saying, well, let's get rid of these single medium schools and balance the equal playing field so everyone can access it, rather than building the capacity of those schools that may not necessarily offer the mother tongue education in other provinces that people inherently speak their own mother tongue? Example, the Eastern Cape, Xhosa, or Limpopo, you've got Bedi, Venda, in different other languages. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your presentation. I want to bring up what you ended your presentation with, which is the rights of parents. And you stated the rights of parents should be respected. If I should summarize on what you've said, should be respected and recognized, and the powers of the minister should not limit the rights of parents or undermine that. If you would please expand, in your view, as you look at the current legislation and your experience in the education sector, to what extent has the state and the minister then therefore, especially with this legislation that is before us now, has limited the rights of parents? And I should add, the rights of parents universally is recognized. And certainly I would say in our constitution, the rights of parents were accepted and therefore it was not stated. Do you foresee that such an amendment should be made in the constitution, given your experience and the risks of the bellable as you have today brought before the committee? Thank you, Chair.
Honorable Murasetla.
Is it my turn, Chair? Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chairperson, and let us appreciate and welcome the presentation from the Christian View Network. A lot was said. Maybe a lot need to be clarified. You see, I'm being intimidated by the very people who must be protecting me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. You see, I was still saying, Chairperson, a lot was said, maybe a lot may need to be clarified. In the first place, I think the first challenge which you are likely to face here is that the Christian View Network might be projecting the fear of the unknown. You see, Chairperson, what is happening, especially in the South African education system, I have not seen a situation whereby the South African education system is patronizing whatever religion at the expenses of the other. I have not seen that, but maybe I will have to be clarified. And secondly, the issue of, as Honorable Sukers is indicating, the violation of the rights of parents. I'm still waiting to be convinced if indeed there is any such insinuation in the bill which may or which appear to be threatening the rights of the parents in the education of their children. There was a clip which was shown during his presentation when he was talking about the homeschooling, where it reflected, I think Honorable Aduans touched it in passing, that the parents taking a risk for a jail term, and so that the homeschooling for his children or their children must be realized. Chair, the greatest challenge that we might be facing, and maybe in some parents, or I mean some other organizations or stakeholders which will still be coming forward here, is we have to consider and take into cognizance that the South African education system exposes education in such a way that it becomes a public asset. And where education becomes a public asset, of course, we may at the end of the day, the system may at the end of the day, trample on the rights of some other private people who want to privatize education in one way or the other, where you will find out that a public notion infringes into the rights of somebody who would love to privatize things and see education run according to his or their own taste. The challenge we are facing, of course, is the real pragmatic challenge. One of the pragmatic challenges we are facing in South Africa is people may love to have education as a private commodity, but going forward, at the same time, they would love the same state to fund the infrastructure, the same state to fund remuneration of educators. Then how, at the end of the day, do we reconcile that? There is no way in which, when we come to the concept of the role of SGBs, you see, for any organization or institution to stand, the center must hold. And in many different schools, with many different SGBs, where are we going to point and say it's our center? The center at the end of the day will have to rely either with the HOD of that department or the MEC, at the end, the Director General and the Minister. They should be the center that must be able to hold in order to direct the education of our country, hence the education to our own children. So I was just trying to make this basis so that going forward, we should have a common footing with common understanding. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I don't see a hand from the virtual platform. I take it that the members that are there are fine. And on that note, no, it's fine, Advocate Misa, I'll know too. I think there are some clarifications that you will have to do from the side of the department too. I was just checking for members, so it's fine. If we do not have members, let me allow you then, Advocate Misa.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to the Honourable Chair, the Honourable members, to the stakeholders of civil society that are present, and colleagues on the platform. I must say that the presentation by the ChristianView network is appreciated. Chairperson, just a point of clarification on a few issues that were raised. So, for example, with regards to homeschooling, which seems to be, a bone of contention in terms of how the department wishes to ensure that its responsibility for ensuring that learners are schooled, is being perceived, needs to be clarified. In a meeting that was held with Minister in 2020, it was the 27th or 28th of January, we did have engagements with representatives from, who represents the homeschooling sector. And there, Minister explained that she encompasses, in fact, she embraces homeschooling because it's a very important part of the education system. And at that particular meeting, we agreed that a once-off registration for homeschooling, when the child begins homeschooling, will be required. And thereafter, when the child moves from phase to phase, it will be just a notification process. And that's what the bill reads. Now, with regards to the fears about conviction, the conviction clause that we have in the bill, that is, subsection 6. And if you look at the Act itself, Section 6 of the Act has always had this penalty clause. All that has been done currently is to increase the period of imprisonment, which was 6 months, it is in the Act as it stands, to 12 months, and to include or to insert that or to both such fine and such imprisonment. Now, one of the reasons for increasing it to 12 months was because of the high dropout rate in schools. It is not targeted at homeschooling at all. And it's not targeted at any individual group at all. It is because of this, we thought that maybe if we increase the penalty clause, that parents will take the issue of ensuring that their child attends schools more seriously in order to prevent the high dropout rates. So that was the purpose of that particular clause when it came to conviction. Also, Chairperson, the issue of the admission policy and the language policy. Yes, indeed, we have given the powers to the HOD to approve an admission policy or a language policy where there have been amendments made to it. And the reason for this is to align it with, case law, which indicated that the control over the implementation of admissions is, it may rest with the head of department. It's not the exclusive, within the exclusive function of the SGB. And hence we gave that position to the head of department. And also many schools were using the admission policy and the language policy to exclude learners. And hence, we've made these changes. And we've also have a deeming clause that where the head of department, where you submit your admission policy or your language policy to the head of department for approval, that if the head of department does not approve it within the time period that has been specified in the bill, within the 60-day period, then it is deemed to be approved. So if there are fears that, there would be an admission policy that would be lying that is not approved, this can be allied by the deeming provision within the Bella bill. With regards to the financial interests of the SGB and declaring the financial interest, the reason for having included that clause, and it came up, it was a provision that was sponsored by, after consultation with CEM, whereby it was felt that we needed to ensure that we stamp out corruption within the education sector, particularly when it comes to giving, for example, if we need to fence a particular school and I'm on the SGB, I then quickly open up a company in my son's name and give the job to my son, in order to prevent and to avoid those kind of situations, to encourage and foster good governance, even amongst SGB members, that we then, after consultation, put in that particular clause. Did I leave out anything else? Yes, Chairperson, and the issue of the rights of parents when it comes to homeschooling, Minister embraces it, and she has even expressed that at the meeting that we had with representatives of the home education sector. And the issue of the competent assessors, that is, a mechanism to ensure that the schooling that is being provided at home by parents for their learners, that it is of a standard that is equivalent to that is presented at a public school. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Advocate Misa. I think those are the clarities that members were seeking from the department. Can I allow you to say something?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay, firstly, I'd like to address these in the order that they were asked. So if I start off with Mr. Boshoff, this question of that South Africa is a secular state, I was challenged that as a myth and very misleading on a number of points, and especially with regard to education. Firstly, the Constitution starts with a preamble that acknowledges God. And secondly, we have specifically a clause on education in the Constitution that allows for religious observances. And I know that that was put in very specifically by the Constitutional Assembly to avoid an American type situation of the 1960 wrong interpretation of the American Constitution that then excluded religious observances in the schools. Now, that clause in the Constitution needs to be read in parallel with the Schools Act, which was written also at the same time, in 1996, and which parallels it in almost identical wording, except for the changing of a few words, which further clarifies that the authority that is intended by the Constitution to make that decision on religious observances is the school governing body. Okay, so that is the first issue. The second issue is that at the time, there was huge protest from parents about the risk that South Africa would have a secular state, and we had a promise specifically from Cyril Ramaphosa that South Africa would not be a secular state. That was reported in the newspaper. So that is on the interpretation. I think you're not going to find any of those people who were around at the time interpreting that way. Further, one has Minister Bengu's policy that he instituted at the time, the first education minister that was after the Constitution, explicitly that his religion policy allowed for different schools to have complete freedom to choose a single medium religious instruction if they wanted to, paralleling the policies of Nigeria and of Israel, for example. So this is a myth, and there are many ways of accommodating difference within the parent body. That includes, firstly, different schools having different policies and people choosing that. Then within a school, you can have streams where people go off and have different religious observances if they want to. And then you can also have conscientious objection, which is a third level to accommodate parents. So that is something which is simply not a correct interpretation. Now, we've had this progressive erosion since Minister Bengu's very good policy of religious freedom and parental rights. That was, and Minister Kada Asmal took a huge chunk out of that freedom with his 2003 religion and education policy. He had a meeting in this building at which I was present, in which he then presented his policy, claiming he had now listened to parents and religious bodies that were protesting against that. I put 10 points that we had not agreed with forward to the group. I was thrown out by security. Okay, there is no agreement. We did not agree to that policy. We continue to protest against that. Then further, there was the court judgment in 2017, which 6 schools were challenged on their religious observances. We would argue that was a wrong court judgment. It should have been appealed. It will be appealed in future. That is not a correct interpretation of the Constitution. Anybody wants to discuss this is welcome to speak to me, or we can have a debate on radio or whatever. But to me, this is a power grab by the state from parents and away from religious freedom, and we want that power back again. Then the question that the parents must, through those structures, decide on how that money is, that public money is distributed in various ways according to their preferences. I can talk more than that. I don't want to run out of time. Then in terms of the question of Mr. Zwele, in what way is the Bella bill taking away that right to decide? These are small incremental erosions every time decision-making power is taken away from parents and given to central government. And we want maximum devolved to the lowest possible level for decisions to be made for those children in homeschooling, in private schools, in that particular school, or in a stream within that school. Then the question of language being used to exclude people. We've got 1 in 20 schools in this country which are using Afrikaans language. And personally, I don't want to speak the Afrikaans language, but I have another friend who has chosen, he's English, but he's chosen to send his children to an Afrikaans school because he likes the religious ethos of that school. And any parent has that choice if they want to go that. My ancestors were German speaking when they came to this country. They had to learn English, but that is for they could have carried on in German if they decided to be homeschooled, but this is the choice we want to give to parents. And look, things are imperfect in any society when we have to make common decisions, but we have to decide which problems the state needs to intervene on. And I'd say where there are really serious problems and parents are wanting help, then the state gets involved on those things. Then the question of which clauses, I'll be happy to read through each clause, but probably I'm going to be given a timeout. So I will make another submission. I've given it in my detailed, our detailed 6-page submission, all the clause numbers, but I will make a summary of the clause numbers to refer to all of these things, and I will send that to the committee secretary. The question of the penalties from Nomaselo, but with homeschooling, I accept that it was not the intention of the department to do this, but we do not want to have a power which can be misused by a political leader in future. And having followed the political process for 30 years, I have seen many times unintended consequences. I've warned about them and they've happened. So I don't put it past this happening. And so we'd like to separate the question of criminal obstruction from parental choice, and so that no parent is ever at risk of going to jail on these things. Then the question of what should remain with parents, I think I've elaborated in a whole lot more detail, and I'd be happy to, if the chairperson would give me more time, but essentially we want to maximize the powers given to parents through those 3 tiers that I just gave, of the school governing body making a policy, of streams within a school, of conscientious objection if the parents not happy with something, and that also includes the right to opt out of things like sex education or religious things they're not happy with. The question of homeschooling, how does one verify these things that was asked? I would propose that each parent should keep a portfolio of what they've been teaching their children that is available for inspection if necessary. That would not require consultants' costs, and particularly the accountability, I would say, would be if some relative then or friend claims, okay, these children are not being educated, while the parent can then produce that portfolio of what they've been teaching them. Then the question of focusing on broken schools, yes, exactly. I think that if there are problems with, some child doesn't get into the school that they want to because of the language policy, that's a pretty minor problem. We've got crisis problems in some schools of complete dysfunction, of gangs dominating the school. Those are the schools that the education department needs to be focusing on, and to get functional. Most of these schools don't have a functional SGB, and those are the schools that need help from the government, not the schools that have a functional SGB having their powers taken away from them. The question on mother tongue education, I would argue that is a debatable question, which is for those parents to answer and not for me to answer. I know I have a friend who started a school in Zululand, English medium, and a lot of parents were very happy to send their children to that. Other people would prefer Zulu medium, or other people want Afrikaans medium. That's not really for us to decide. That is for those parents to make that decision, and according to the choices that are available to them. And I'd also want that widened choice to include cottage schools. Then the question of not limiting the powers of the parent, I think one only wants to limit the powers of the parents with respect to other parents, where there is a need to force for a common policy. But within the framework that I proposed, you'd have a maximum diversity and empowerment of parents. So the question of amending the Constitution, personally, I don't think the Constitutional needs amendment on this, on the education clause. It already allows for this question of religious ethos. It's just that it's been wrongly interpreted by the court. I did have a discussion with one of the lawyers who was involved in drafting the Constitution, and he expressed to me that he felt that his one regret was a failure to include a clause on the protection of the family, and quite possibly that is an amendment that we need to include, paralleling the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. That is also in the Western Cape Constitution. So possibly, yes, that would be a good idea, but I don't think the problem is the Constitution. I think the problem is the way the Constitution is being misinterpreted by, I think, secularists and woke people who believe that their interpretation is the only one that is allowed in the schools. I don't think it's correct. Yeah, so with respect to these, the rebuttal of the department, I appreciate they didn't have that intended effect, but I'm been involved in making submissions on many laws which had unintended effects, and we don't want the possibility of those effects. And we've got to look at the question of what is the greater evil that we are trying to avoid, as opposed to these other problems. And the greater evil is avoided by giving maximum power to parents to make decisions. There will be some flaws, but that is the best way forward. Then in terms of this avoidance of corruption, yes, I agree we need to avoid corruption, but this is complete overkill. Corruption is avoided by strong SGBs and accountability to the parents that would get the best people off not wanting to be part of the SGB. And one can deal with this clause. Section 36 of the Constitution requires looking at the less restrictive means to achieve what an end. And the less restrictive means that I would propose is that any business that an SGB person has with the school should be publicly disclosed, and preferably they shouldn't be allowed to do any business at all. They don't need to declare every single thing that they are doing. They're sacrificing a whole lot of their time and their skills to help the school, and good people are going to be discouraged from that. You don't need to get them to violate their financial privacy, much less that of their children or their wife or somebody who might not want to do that. So my appeal is that the solution is empowering parents and letting them sort out the problems rather than to try and sort out all the problems for them. And where government puts its effort is not into micro-regulating homeschooling, and functional SGBs, but into dealing with these enormous problems where you have gangs and drug pushers that are dominating certain schools. We need to strengthen those so that they have parent-led situations. And also in terms of improvement, there's two proposals. One is that I've spoken to the school governing body associations, and they have offered to help other schools that don't have good governing bodies to become functional. That proposal hasn't been accepted. The second proposal is that one allows charter schools, which are partnerships with independent organizations, which can be a business or an NGO, that then says, we will work in partnership with the school, they will have our ethos, and we will put money and time and effort into that. So then that becomes semi-private. We've never had a situation where everybody is happy with the Department of Education's policy, but this framework for diversity is the best solution that we can come up with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosenthal. You've taken quite a lot of time. I hope the next presenters, we allowed him because he's the first presenter. But also, my request is that the presenters that are going to come, I don't want to really to mingle on your presentation, but on the issues that he has raised, just touch base and leave them if you feel that, not unless you feel you've got something more different from what he has raised. But I want to say that we have noted what you have raised as the committee, and that's what we will be doing with all the presentations. We are noting what you are saying. We are taking them into consideration because this is the phase of oral submissions. We are still going to go to a phase of public participation, which is going to be public hearings, probably very early next year. So it's still a process. So we have noted, and we thank you very much for coming to Parliament to present the views of the ChristianView network. And we thank you very much, Mr. Rosenthal, and we wish you well for the rest of the day and many days to come. Thank you. We are going to get S.A.O without any break.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity afforded to the President of the S.A.O, Dr. Louis Swanepoel, sitting behind me, and myself, Chris Klopper, the CEO of the S.A.O. Madam Chair, I'm going to deal with my presentation in two parts. First of all, just a short presentation just to highlight the main points, and then I'll go to the specific clauses in the bill itself. And I trust that my submission has been provided to the honourable members and that we will deal with it on specific clauses. Madam Chair, with regard to the questions and the time allocation, my colleague took 20 minutes for his presentation and the questions posed by the honourable members took 25 minutes. So just as an aside. So it wasn't he that wasted the time. Okay. Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to submit comment and discussion. We reaffirm our commitment to the advancement of a quality public education system. Since pre-1996, we consistently endorsed the principle of governance and partnership principles. And if you look at the Act, it was based on 3 levels: at the national level, the provincial level, as well as the school level. And those are the levels that the School Act is based on. We have an intimate knowledge of those principles. We were part and parcel of the Hunter Commission that preceded the SA Schools Act. And I myself, I was actively involved in the formulation and the drafting of the SA Schools Act in 1995 and 1996, amongst others in this particular room itself, under the guidance of Dr. Bladen Zimande, and the Minister of Education at that stage was Minister Bengu. What we will see there is we've taken notes over the past 26 years of the various judgments in the Constitutional Court, and they have enunciated and supported the principles of cooperative governance. And that principles of cooperative governance you will find in the Welkom case as well. The Welkom case made mention of the white paper in education. The white paper in education specifically says that the SA Schools Act is a democratic principle. It is based on the principle that there are partners and that parents and the school governing bodies are valuable partners as well. So our comment is based on the principle of cooperative governance, and that is the basic point of departure that we're going to deal with this particular matter. Madam Chair, based on Bella itself, we believe that the principle of a public school as a democratic extension of the particular community and that of partnership is now, for all intents and purposes, something of the past. There's now only one dominant player, and I've heard the questions that have been raised about that the state has to be central. But Madam Chair, we are sitting in a political and a constitutional dispensation where centrality is the principle of democracy, where people have a choice and not necessarily that the state determines everything. Where we express views that may be different from that as expressed in the bill, please do not see it as an attempt to be obstructive. We all have a right to voice our opinions, and that is what we are doing. But see this as an attempt to improve education, and we are desperately seeking ways and options to improve public education. The parameters of the debate are clear. Does the state revert to a state school system? And Madam Chair, that is what the committee has to ask itself. Or do we wish to remain as a public school system? And there are vast differences. The state school system is that particular dispensation that existed pre-1996, also pre-1976. Or do we want to have a public school system where a school is regarded as an extension of the particular community? If we look at contentious as well as, let's say, acceptable amendments, we fully support the following principles: no unfair discrimination on the basis of race, gender, or any arbitrary ground. School facilities must be utilized fairly and educationally accountable. And that includes that there must be no discrimination based on the principle of language, or that language must be used as a barrier for entry to a particular school. Let's put that on the table and let's get that elephant out of the room. We support the principle that language must not be used as an exclusion. The contentious amendments are the following. Section 5 and Section 6. With regard to Section 5, especially the reference to that the HOD has the final authority, and the language policy that the HOD may approve the language policy of a school and may return it with those recommendations as he or she may deem necessary. And then also the instruction that there can be a direction provided to a school that they must adopt another language of learning and teaching. We would also like to give comment on the principle of learner discipline. We agree with the principle that there must be a prohibition on corporal punishment, but not enough is being done in regard to the rights of educators and the silent majority of learners in the school system versus the rights of the perpetrators who are guilty of serious misconduct. A lot has been said about that they are entitled to due process, but the silent majority in the school, nothing is being said about their rights. Their right to a safe school environment, their right to a disciplined environment, their right to have a culture of learning and teaching in the school. And we believe something needs to be said about that. The question of disclosure of financial interest of SGB members, we believe it will fall foul of the POPI Act. And we'll explain that a bit later. And then the unilateral, and I use the phrase inverted commas, unilateral utilization of school facilities. We believe it's not acceptable the way it is phrased. And then also the principle of compulsory centralized procurement. You will also see there that it is stated in inverted commas. And we believe that if you look at what happens in practice, it actually comes down to a centralized procurement system. And the procurement of PPEs during the past COVID-19 lockdown period actually graphically illustrates the danger of that. With regard to the other amendments, Madam Chair, we believe that it is possible to live with those proposed amendments. More specifically, if we look at admission policy, we say that the aggrieving phrase there is the final authority, that particular phrase. If we look at the constitutionality in terms of section 29(2), we believe that the judgment as passed down in the Rivonia court, it has actually, validated and vindicated the current wording in the Act, and that it provides all the necessary protection in the current Act. We have subjected Bella to 2 separate legal counsels who are not related to each other, and we asked them to test the current bill against those judgments, against this particular judgment. And independently, they found it doesn't comply. We think that the envisaged unnecessary veto power provided to the HOD undoubtedly and unnecessarily opens the door for formal constitutional contestation. If we look at the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, if you look at the principle that all 24,000 public schools will have to be considered in terms of the principles of a just administrative action, that means it has to be fair, it has to be uniform, it has to be rational. And you can't do it selectively, that has to be considered. And then we also need to take cognizance of the fact that if school communities are not satisfied with the decision of the local district office or the HOD, and let's be honest about this, it will be delegated to the district office. That particular district office will take the decision, not the HOD. Let's just look at the facts. 2,000 schools in Gauteng, the HOD can't consider 2,000 admission policies. It has to be delegated. So that will be taken on review. Then the question of numerical realities. 24,000 public schools, and all policies will have to be considered in terms of PAIA, the promotion of administrative justice. If done selectively, it will fall foul of PAIA. And then the criteria to determine the capacity of a school. You will see that when we deal with the detail of the proposed amendments to admission as well as language, it refers to space. And Madam Chair, there is no objective criterion to determine what is regarded as the fair utilization of space. And I'll come back to this particular, and this is what I would like to. We say, and all educators agree with this principle, you reach a critical point when a school is regarded as full. But we are dealing with 87 school districts in South Africa. So if 87,000 or 87 school districts have to apply the principle of when is a school regarded as full, it will be 87 different yardsticks. We need a uniform yardstick in education. If you look at Regulation 9 of the minimum norms and standards for public school infrastructure, and we've written a letter in this regard to the minister to say that this needs urgent attention. Regulation 9 of the minimum norms and standards states that for grades 1 to 12, a learner requires 1 square meter. Madam Chair, it's impossible to fit a learner with a desk, a chair, and a school case in 1 square meter and still have space for aisles and movement of the teacher. So we need an objective criterion in this regard. Section 5.5 of the SA Schools Act refers to the requirement of minimum norms and standards and the duties of the minister to determine those minimum norms and standards. It was promulgated in 2013. At that stage, there was the promise something would be done about this, and we would move towards a dispensation where we would have 1 yardstick, how to determine space in a school. And let's be honest about it. This question of is a school full or is it not full is the bone of contention in all those places where conflict has arisen. So we say that 1 square meter per learner doesn't comply with PAIA. It is not rational, it is not fair, and it's not reasonable. And it's definitely not educationally accountable. So we implore the committee to do something about this as well. If we look at the question of language, the 2 phrases there that cause problems for us is that the head of department may approve the language policy and then revert to the governing body with such recommendations. Now, all those recommendations in all probability will be directions. Let's be honest about it. And again, it's not the HOD that will do it. It will be the district office. And notwithstanding the provisions of subsection 2, the head of department may direct, and let's look at this, it's direct now, a public school to adopt more than 1 language of instruction. And again, I say, and we want to reiterate it and record it, that we are opposed to the principle that a language is used as an exclusion for admission to a school. With regard to the constitutionality, we agree with the first phrase of it, but it is almost rendered nugatory if you look at the provisions of subsections 5 and 13, and I'll get to that particular point. Our formal proposal is retain the current section 6 in regard to language policy in schools. It has passed constitutional scrutiny, and the provision of any more powers to the provincial department / district office is superfluous. The Constitutional Court has interpreted the current formulation in terms of the Ermelo case, where language was the bone of contention, and they used the principle of there's space in the school, and because there's space in the school, another language of learning and teaching must be allowed, and we agree with that particular judgment. And we have likewise subjected this particular phrase to 2 legal counsels, and they have also determined that it does not comply. The question of the numerical reality, again, 24,000 language policies that will have to be adjudicated, unless the consideration will be done on a selective basis. And let's be honest about it. If you look at the number of Afrikaans single medium schools, because that's the elephant in the room, there are 2 single medium Afrikaans schools in Limpopo. In Mpumalanga, there are 3. In the majority of schools in the Western Cape and the Northern Cape, the Afrikaans single medium schools are colored schools. They're not white schools, because this is what we are saying to each other here. And let's be honest about this. And we're putting this on the table, and we don't want to be, coy about this particular matter. We say avoid litigation. The veto power provided to the HOD unnecessarily opens the door for constitutional contestation, because we adjudicated this against the white paper the Hunter Commission, and the way that we discussed and the development of the SA Schools Act. Instead, Madam Chair, we would advocate that for those well-functioning schools, that the current governance model in place for 26 years, it is time to reconsider that. Many public schools are comparable to the best private schools in South Africa. And what I mean by that is, they do not aspire for 100% pass rate. They aspire for 100% university exemption, and they do achieve it. So we say for those well-functioning schools, use criteria like the following. Has your financial management passed for 5 years? Did you receive a clean audit? Did you maintain academic standards for 5 years that complies with minimum requirements? To those schools, give them more autonomy and then spend the time for those schools that do require further attention. Madam Chair, that is just a short introduction. What I will do now is I'll take the bill itself and then just page it clause by clause. The first one I'd like to refer to is under the definitions when it deals with grade R. We agree with the principle of grade R, that it must be implemented. But Madam Chair, we must all take cognizance of the fact that we currently have 400,000 funded posts in education. If you add 1 million learners to the system, if you apply a ratio of 30 learners per class for grade R, which is a large class, you're looking at 33,000 additional educators that need to be appointed and 33,000 classes that have to be built. Now, please continue with the implementation of grade R, but it mustn't impact negatively on the other phases. That's an important issue, and we want to emphasize that. Implement it, but it mustn't impact negatively on the other phases, or otherwise we're going to have serious problems. That's the first one. And then, Madam Chair, if I refer you to specifically the admission to public schools, under under 1, a public school must admit, there's a reference to that, and must serve. It is stated in absolute terms. It can't be absolute. Let me give an example. We endorse the principle, but the wording is of such a nature that it might not be possible for a school to give effect to the principle. For example, in an instance where a learner is blind, it might not be possible for an ordinary school to provide meaningful education. And then also that particular school does not have an educator who is trained and they do not have the equipment, for example, the Braille equipment. So look at that particular question of stated in absolute terms. Then, Madam Chair, on the 4B, we would say that in facilitating the admission of learners to public schools, that particular clause deals with undocumented learners. Insert there in facilitating admission of undocumented learners to schools, because that's what it deals with. And if you look further on, you will see it refers to the required documents. Then under C, the admission of a learner to a public school to grade R is age 4, turning 5 by 30 June. Madam Chair, elsewhere it refers that the compulsory school age is actually 5, turning 6. And we must be clear about that. It highlights the phenomenon of which the Act will have to take cognizance, that the developmental milestones achieved by young children aged 4 to 5 and those to be achieved by children 5 to 6 are not the same. So there's something to consider and look at that particular matter as well. Then, Madam Chair, if I go to the next one, it deals with the admission to schools. We've dealt with that in absolute terms. Then we come to language policy, Madam Chair, section 5 of the bill. It deals with section 6. No, apologies. I've missed one important one that deals with admission. Under D, it refers to has the final authority. Under C, it refers to with such recommendations as may be necessary. And remember what I said, and that is that the HOD will not do this. This will be done by the district office. And then it also deals with, and if you look under subsection D, what must they consider in those factors when they determine this? It refers to under Roman numeral 4 to the space available at the school for learners. And that deals with the question, when is a school regarded as full? We still need that particular yardstick. We have emphasized the principle of cooperative governance. We've emphasized that the courts at various levels have endorsed and reinforced this principle. And it needs to be reiterated, Madam Chair, that the best interest of a larger collective community and those of a minority are not necessarily compatible. And what we would like to say is that the effect of the provision is to remove from the purview of the governing body a significant political function. The authority will in practice lie at the level of the district office, as the reality is that the HOD will delegate this to a lower level. So, Madam Chair, that is something that we need to take cognizance of, and how we're going to deal with that. And then also the question of a triennial review, that every 3 years, you have to reconsider the language policy of 24,000 schools by 87 district offices. It makes it extremely difficult. Madam Chair, if we go specifically to section 6, specifically there, if you just look at the realities. Limpopo, there are 3 Afrikaans single medium schools. In Mpumalanga, there are 2. In the Northwest, there are 6. KZN, there are 2. In Gauteng, there are about 15 of them. In the Western Cape and the Northern Cape, they are predominantly colored schools. So it is something that needs to be considered. So, Madam Chair, what we would like to say is the following. Please consider this. Consider the principle that we're taking a lot of powers away from school governing bodies, and that the principle of cooperative governance doesn't find any favor in terms of the current formulation. And as I've stated before, in Ermelo, the current formulation has met the test of the Constitutional Court. Madam Chair, if I take it to another one that is important, just to make sure that I'm at the right place. It deals with the question of serious misconduct and learner discipline. We agree with the principle that corporal punishment is not allowed. But, Madam Chair, it is important to also note that a lot has been said about the rights of the perpetrators, but the rights of educators and the rights of learners, the vast majority, nothing is being said about their rights. And from an educational point of view, we need to say more about that. That's an important issue. If we move on to Madam Chair, to the amendment of section 18A, it deals with the disclosure of financial information by the SGB members. We understand why it has to be declared. But look at the practical realities. If we take, for example, there are 24,000 public schools. 24 public schools have at least 6 school governing body members. You're looking at 144,000 people whose information have to be checked. I'm telling you now, Madam Chair, we do not have the ability to check 144,000 people in terms of the Companies Act, in terms of their FICA considerations and things like that. And in any way, how are schools going to protect that particular information? We understand, and it's a noble intention, but we have to be more practical with regard to that particular matter. Then, Madam Chair, if we look at section 15, or that purports to amend section 20 of the SA Schools Act, the utilization of school facilities, we are also not in favor of that. We need to look at the mitigating formulation on how to deal with that particular matter. And then if we move on to section 16 that purports to amend section 21, it deals with the question of central procurement. In practice, it becomes compulsory. And we believe that central procurement is part of the problem of, let's call it what it's supposed to be called, and that is corruption. And we believe that if you look what happened with the PPEs and the bills that actually sprung from that, it is something that we cannot afford in South Africa. Just want to make sure that I've covered everything. Thank you, Madam Chair. That is my proposal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klopper. It was very clear. Very crystal. I'm discouraging you from speaking a lot. Actually, but it's fine. Let me allow members to engage. S.A.O. Honorable Boshoff, that's my Mkaya. We are from one district with Mr. Boshoff. Pixley, Nwar Mensa.
Yes, yes, we are neighbors, the chair and I. Now, I would just like to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on the difference between a public school system and a state school system. You briefly referred to it, but I think it's it's an essential part of this discussion. If you could maybe elaborate on the differences and the pros and cons. Thank you, Honorable Chair.
Honorable Sukers.
Mine is a point of clarity. Ek wil hom amper Afrikaans vra. Jy is omdat hulle van die Noord-Kaap praat. Maar ek weet ons is nou 'n klomp mense van verskillende areas. I just want clarity specifically when it comes to what you've raised. If you could expand on the issue of when is a school considered full? And you mentioned in your presentation, and I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, so you can correct me. You said the right of the minority or the right of the majority should not exceed, and I'm loosely using wording, it's not directly, that of the minority. If you could expand on that. And the reason for that is because when it comes specifically to the Western Cape, I'll use an example because that is my constituency. It is a very important, or let's rather say it's a very concerning thing, especially in the beginning of the year. And we've had a few with this committee specifically, where we had children not in schools already in June, or let's say in February, March, not June, but February, March, certainly. We had children not in schools, and we were faced with some schools where 30 in a class is considered too many kids in a school, and the school would say they're full. And you add in another district or another school in the same district, in fact, 40 children in a school, and that school makes allowance for children to come in. So I would really like to hear from you in terms of what you've mentioned. How do you foresee the rights of children where they share language. In some cases they don't, but in most cases they do, and they live in same areas. How do we deal with the issue of placing children? Because this committee deals with that quite a lot. And I think I'm asking you to do that with the sensitivity, because the issue of language in full schools becomes so easily a political matter. And we need, as South Africans, to really find the place where we deal with the best interest of our children outside of any other political issue. So I would really appreciate it if you could speak to that. Thank you very much for the presentation. As the chair said, it was very, very clear. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Advocate Misa? Oh, your hand, I did not see it.
I can see you're trying to manage me, Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was very, very clear on the points. And Chair, there's just 4 quick points from my side. One, I'd like to suggest that the clause by clause comments that have been made, including, I mean, there are some critical things here around, for example, when a child is supposed to, when it's compulsory for a child to go to school. I think there's valid points that have been made in terms of age and other things. And I think it'll be helpful when we deal with the oral submissions to actually take into consideration the clause by clause comments that have been submitted by S.A.O, which actually become very helpful. The question I have is, you make a point around compulsory grade R education, which is in principle supported, which is all good. And then you've then further went and made a calculation as to how many teachers may be required and how many learners and how many classrooms may then be required. Is that a calculation that you've done yourself? Because I asked this because there's a request that's standing from my side of trying to request the National Treasury to make a determination of the practical implementation of grade R being compulsory, and whether wouldn't it cause a constitutional challenge for us at a later stage when actually we can't implement it. You know, the department being inundated with court challenges left, right, and center because maybe they can't implement that. So is that a calculation that you've done yourself, or determination that you've done yourself? And if so, it would be interesting if you could maybe share with us as to how you got to those. And Chair, my request to invite the National Treasurer still stands to kind of present to us on whether this is practically implementable, and maybe when the advocate speaks from the DBE, maybe they can enlighten us on that. That's the first one. The second one, I just need to get my notes here quickly. The second one is around the centralization of procurement, which is clause 21A, which you've indicated. I just want to get what is your get clear, what is the proposal that you put in place? Because I did see a presentation around, you know, indicating that there are public schools that basically compete with private schools to kind of get 100% bachelor's pass for their learners, and the various criteria that you put in place on what can be used to determine whether a school can procure that by themselves or not. So what proposal would you then make around this particular clause? Because the reality is that there are schools that, I mean, I visited a school where I stormed out in Northwest, where the SGB literally cut a tree for like 40,000 rand. But, you know, having appointed somebody who's a friend of the SGB's chairperson. So there are instances in which this actually does happen. I mean, you know, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't believe about whether centralizing the procurement of some of these things would actually work. But it would be interesting to hear, how do you then deal with a school that you've now presented to us that can be able to manage their finances well, perform well, and so on, and in procuring their own things, compared to a school whereby, you know, the chairperson can abuse that power and appoint a friend and cut a tree for 40,000 rand. So it would be interesting to hear that. I think, Chair, that's it from my end. I just wanted to check that, but I think the presentation generally was clear in terms of which clauses you submit on. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Chair. There's one thing that I forgot. I was actually disturbed by the comment by the advocate from the Department of Basic Education that said we want to arrest parents to curb dropouts. That just, it puzzles me. I just need clarification on that. What does that mean? That, look, you know, we'll arrest parents for 12 months because we're trying to keep children in school. It's, yeah, that's the fourth point that I forgot, Chair. Maybe if I can get clarity on that. Thanks.
About once? I'm fine. Okay. Thank you for being kind. Advocate Misa.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chairperson, I think that, you know, the presentation is appreciated, and that some of the provisions, for example, that were raised with regards to the central procurement is not mandatory. It's written in terms whereby the head of department may use its discretion, and it will be done in consultation with the governing body to centrally procure identified learning and teaching support material for public schools. And the reason for this was to ensure that there is, to ensure cost effectiveness, and that, you know, we utilize public funds in a cost effective manner. So it is not compulsory when it comes to the issue of central procurement. The issue of the grade R, indeed, we have been in talks with the National Treasury about providing the funding for the introduction of grade R as compulsory, and we are still in talks with National Treasury, and that this will be appropriated from the existing funds of the department when it comes to grade R. The issue of clarity with regards to the clause dealing with conviction, and that to arrest parents, no, that is not the intention. The intention is that this, as a more severe penalty clause, will serve as a deterrent, so that parents take sending and monitoring that their child attends school and does not drop out of school more seriously. The intention is not to arrest more parents, but rather to make the to increase the severity of the punishment, so that parents can take this particular, the education of their learners, seriously. The issue of a review of the language policy after 3 years as well, Chairperson, it is also written in, it's not mandatory, but you know, they could look at after 3 years, consider that if the language policy needs to be reviewed. And indeed, and that was the intention of that particular clause. If it needs to be reviewed, then it may. I think I've addressed the issue of the language policy. You know, when we addressed the issue of, or when the ChristianView network presented, Chairperson, those are, the veto power of the HOD that the S.A.O referred to. And, he refers to a case law, the Rivonia judgment, but it's the very same case law that also says that the HOD, of the department is not rigidly bound by a school's admission policy when exercising the authority to admit learners. The policy serves as a guide and cannot bind the head of department inflexibly. Those are some of the judgments that we say also support why we've made the HOD the final, given the power to make the final approval. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
No, thank you very much. Mr. Klopper, do you want to say?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I take the questions and the answers in seriatim, with regard to the question, the difference between a public school and a state school is the following. A public school is an extension of the particular community. It is regarded as a democratic institution and it reflects the values and norms of that particular community. And the community takes the decisions that are in the best interest of the community and the children. A state school system is where it is controlled from a central point of view, where the final authority with regard to everything lies with the Department of Education. And understand the principle that for many schools it is absolutely necessary, and that's why there is provision for a Section 20 school and a Section 21 school. But the reality is that the public school system that we have now is where it lies in the hands of the school governing bodies as your third tier of governance and where they take the decisions. And that was the principle that was discussed in this particular house in 1995, 94, 96, before we accepted the SA Schools Act. It was based on the white paper in education that is based on the principle of cooperation, of mutual trust and partnership. And we would like to see that particular matter taken forward. And the plea is, please retain the current wording. It reflects that particular principle. Trust parents, and those parents that do not comply, address them. But don't punish those that are not, in offending anyone else in the process. So that is our plea at this current moment. With regard to when is a school full, that is exactly the question that we are asking. And whenever that particular question arises, that is what arose in Ermelo, that is what arose in Rivonia, that is what is arose at Oeverval, and we can continue like that. The question is always, when is it full? When I participated in a public debate, and I said, we need this, and it was a public debate under the guidance of the Human Rights Commission, I was told by an MEC to say, he will decide when a school is full. Now, Madam Chair, that is not educationally accountable. All we are saying is, let's get one yardstick, how to determine when a school is full. And then the argument is off the table. That's what we're asking for. And Regulation 9 of the minimum norms and standards provides that. The question was also further expanded on that there are a large number of learners, excuse me, who will not be able to accommodate it, at the beginning of next year. Madam Chair, that is a symptom of a school building program that is not adhered to. And we need adherence to the school building program because that's a symptom of it. And that is why we have now asked, in terms of the promotion of access to information, we've asked the Department of Education, explain to us exactly what has happened with the school building program in Gauteng and in the Western Cape. Excuse me. And I believe that we will find that they haven't complied with the school building program. So that's an important issue that we need to address. And that also deals with the question of, is it overcrowding or is it not overcrowding? And let's be honest about this. If you look at the principle of overcrowding, there's a direct relationship between overcrowding and the quality of education. And if we aspire to a quality education system, we have to comply with the school building program. That's what we want at the end of the day. Excuse me. With regard to grade 1 and the 1 million learners, if you look at the current system, you're looking at approximately per grade about 1 million learners in every age cohort. And we will find that in all probability, grade R will also add about 1 million learners to the system. The moment that it becomes compulsory, it will add a further 1 million learners to the system. So that will place severe challenges to the system, post-provisioning, classes, and school building programs. With regard to the centralization of procurement, what is the proposal? I can understand that you would dearly like people to declare their interests. But the reality is you can't go and check 144,000 people's credentials. It's impossible. Maybe we should consider something similar to what is used in the Companies Act. And that is that at each and every meeting, there has to be a declaration of a conflict of interest. That's what happens at some of the large companies, and where they sit down and they say, before we start the meeting, declare your interest on the following issues on the table. And when that particular issue is declared, and people in the community know when people have a conflict of interest, that particular person must be recused, whether he or she is the chairperson of the committee or not. Implement that. I'm not going to comment on the question of the dropouts and the question that arrests may be a deterrent. With regard to the principle of central procurement, Madam Chair, what happens in practice is, beginning of the year, schools are faced and all of a sudden textbooks and LTSM is delivered at the school. And then it is deducted from their school allocations for that particular year. And that is central procurement. It happens each and every year in provinces like Limpopo. It happens in many provinces. And what we are saying is give the school a choice. Trust teachers, trust the school governing body. Because, colleagues, we sit here and we must have this particular relationship of trust, even though we differ from opinion from each other. But we must trust the integrity of each other. And that is what we are pleading for. We will always have bad people amongst us, but the majority of people are good-natured and we must trust them. I'm extremely gladdened by the fact that they are having discussions with Treasury in regard to the financing of grade R, and we would like to participate in that, because it's not only that. Do you know that we are going to look at 33,000 posts that will be created? But there are only 10,000 people who are qualified. What are we going to do with the other 20,000? How are we going to train them? How are we going to register them with SAIS? Because we can't be contributing to the principle of dumbing down the profession. It must be qualified teachers and they must be registered with SAIS. So that is another question that must be asked. And we've asked many questions in this regard, and there were a lot of dry swallows and a lot of heavy breathing, but we haven't got distinctive, clear answers on that particular matter. With regard to the review of the language policy, I think we've expanded on that particular matter enough. And then the HOD's role in this particular process, Madam Chair, I can't emphasize it enough to say that the HOD will not take that particular decision. It will be done at the level of the district office, and that's where the conflict is going to arise. And that is where we need to trust each other. And that is how we need to manage this particular system. It's based on the principle of trusting each other. And let's not use the exception as the rule. That's all I'd like to say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Klopper, and thank you to S.A.O. too. I must say that I must say that we were also noting your presentation. Like I'm saying, it was very clear. And I must say, from myself as well, I have noted that you are endorsing most of the provisions that are relating to the Employment of Educators Act. And I'm impressed from, I mean, we're a teachers union. After that, the only thing that I think you have mentioned when we were speaking is the misconduct of learners, where really we're speaking of the teachers. But I must say thank you very much. We have noted your input in your presentation as the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the honorable members and thank you for considering our submission. Thank you. God bless.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Members, we are just going to have a slight change in our program. We're supposed to have now Human Rights Commission and Equal Education, and Western Cape Commissioner for Children, but we have a request from Equal Education that they ask to present because the presenter is not feeling well. She's got some issues of health. So if she can present and then we allow her to leave after that. So over to you, madam. Thank you. That's Equal Education, right?
Education and Eco Education Law Center. Yeah, Eco Education and Eco Education Law Center.
This is a joint presentation with Equal Education Law Center. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, honorable members, and to all other guests. Thank you for the opportunity to present. My name is Jane Borman. I'm here on behalf of Eco Education. This is my colleague, Anjali Maestri, who's here on behalf of Eco Education Law Center. We also have with us today Gertrude Kwan and Ibrahim Davids, who are also from the Eco Education Law Center and will assist with answering questions. As other presenters have highlighted, the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act provides a critical opportunity to examine and develop school laws, and it will impact learners, teachers, schools, and educators, and communities for decades to come. We have provided a written submission which covers a number of topics. However, for the purpose of this presentation, we will be focusing just on 4 key issues. If you could just give us a moment, we'll be sharing the screen. Great. Thank you. Apologies for that slow start. Like I've stated, we're Eco Education and Eco Education Law Center, and this is a presentation covering our joint submission. Now, the 4 issues that we are going to touch on are school governing body powers. We will specifically touch on school admissions, teachers' appointments, and language policy, as well as alcohol in schools, required documentation, and criminalization. Firstly, with regard to school governing bodies, it is important when looking at school governing body powers to understand the context in which we are operating. As stated by Higher Education Minister Blade Nzimande, moving out of apartheid, our policies were crafted in a context where ensuring a smooth transition was as important as developing progressive policies for social transformation. We must now assess and rethink the balance between the key roles of school governing bodies and the need to eliminate and eradicate discriminatory school policies. As you'll see here, we also believe that the BELA is attempting to confirm case law, which particularly looks at the role of school governing bodies and acknowledges their critical role, but also acknowledges the importance for final oversight responsibility to ensure equity. Admissions to public schools is covered in Section 5 of SASSA. Eco Education and the Eco Education Law Center are in support of the inclusion of the provision that requires school governing bodies to be consulted before learner placement, and that school governing bodies be given an opportunity to appeal. We also welcome the additional factors that the head of department must take into account, such as the effective and efficient use of state resources, as well as shortening the appeal time. So overall, we welcome this amendment. Regarding teachers' appointments in section 21 of SASA, once again, Equal Education and Equal Education Law Center are in support of the removal of the amendment that proposed school governing bodies be involved in post-level 1 teacher appointments only. Just for clarity, the 2017 draft made an amendment that would that they would only be involved in post-level 1 teachers, but this has been removed in the 2022 draft bill, and we are firmly in support of that. However, we acknowledge that the initial draft in 2017 was attempting to resolve a specific problem, namely the need for transformation and strong school management, knowledgeable and skilled interviewers needed for higher posts, and undue influence regarding school teachers unions and influences that might impact schools' decisions around teachers' appointment. Therefore, while we are pleased that this proposed amendment was reversed, we do believe that the initial issue does need to be addressed. We therefore recommend that the Department of Basic Education consider alternative amendments to Section 20I to fully address the originally identified issues. These include strengthening accountability processes in the cases of wrongdoing or wrongfully appointing teachers, consequences for those who take no steps against perpetrators of malpractice, specifically at the school level. Avenues for malpractice reporting, where individuals in school positions can report issues regarding the appointment, malpractice in the appointment of teachers, stronger whistleblower protection, and instances to address cases of weak provincial and district oversight of appointment. Then finally, Equal Education welcomes the amendments, which gives provincial education departments greater oversight of school language policies. The Constitutional Court has recognized the potential inequalities that can result from rigid language policies. In AfriForum versus Free State, they stated that an issue arises where scarce resources are deployed to cater for a negligible number of students, affording them close, personal, and very advantageous attention, while other students are crowded in lecture rooms. We also believe that this has been posed as a false dichotomy. We do not believe that this has to be a choice between, on the one hand, safeguarding mother tongue instruction, and on the other hand, preventing language policies being used as a proxy for racist practice and preservation of privilege, which obstructs effective and equitable planning and the management of resources in the education sector. Although we welcome the amendment, we believe that it needs to go a step further. Firstly, regarding the HOD's considerations when evaluating a school's language policy, we believe that in addition to the considerations already listed, they should add that the HOD must consider the extent of excess capacity in a single medium school and trends in this regard, and the availability of and accessibility to other similarly resourced public schools for learners who are language barred from attending the single medium school. Oh no, that is correct. Secondly, regarding language policies, and specifically the ability for the head of department to change a single medium to a dual medium school, we recommend that these additional factors be added for their consideration. The extent of excess capacity in the case of single medium schools and trends in this regard, demand for conversion to a dual medium school for that particular school and that particular area, availability or accessibility to other similarly resourced public schools for language barred learners who have applied to that particular school. The geographical area that learners attending the single medium school come from, and other curriculum options offered. Lastly, on regarding the need to guard against language policies used as a proxy for racist practices, we request that the additional be added to the Bella Bill. Firstly, that it emphatically states that it is not for school governing bodies itself to apply language policy in admission of entry phase learners. Secondly, that school governing bodies may not turn away potential applicants by indicating to them that they would be unable to apply to the school because of the language, the language medium. School governing bodies may also not refuse to include learners on admissions waiting lists. It must also be clear that all information regarding those who would like to apply to a school and put in applications be provided to the provincial education department so that have a full idea of the scope of requests regarding admission to that school. That concludes the brief summary of the input on school governing bodies. Secondly, on the sale of alcohol at public schools, EE and the EELC strongly urge that this clause be removed in its entirety. Speaking to our parent members, as well as speaking to many of our learner members, it is very, very clear that alcohol abuse is a serious crisis that affects communities across the country. As you will have seen from the various submissions that written submissions that have been made to the committee, civil societies, communities, and health groups have expressed deep concern at this amendment and what we expect to be its unintended consequences. To briefly highlight the main concerns, one, that it will harm learners, both in terms of increasing their access to alcohol at school events, as well as increasing the likelihood of them being around inebriated adults. We are also concerned that it will not be properly implemented and monitored, and therefore there is a wide scope for abuse. We are also concerned that it will not follow the best interests of the child, and that this amendment or this proposed amendment will fall foul of some other national and provincial school policies and regulations that are in place. As I said in the last point, that it will be in direct contradiction to various national policies and safeguarding guidelines that repeatedly emphasize the need to keep schools as alcohol and drug-free zones. Eco-Education and Eco-Education Law Centre do propose a number of, if the committee and the Department of Basic Education is not opening to fully removing this clause, which we believe is needed, we have provided a number of recommendations and suggestions. Due to wanting to keep the presentation short, we haven't included these in the slide, but I will be happy to provide, those suggestions are in the longer written submission, and we would be happy to provide comment on those if questions arise. Moving over to my colleague, we will now consider the last 2 points.
Thank you very much. And thank you for accommodating me, and please bear with me, but I'll still try to stick to the timelines that we've been afforded. So as mentioned, I'm Anjali Maestri. I'm also an attorney at Equal Education Law Centre, and I'm going to be speaking through documentation requirements that are contained within BELA, and then also the criminalization of parents in BELA. So to start, I think the important thing to say is that in 2019, the Makhanda High Court handed down a judgment that held that sections 15 and sections 21 of the National Admissions Policy unjustifiably limited the right to basic education, in that it required a birth certificate to be provided in order to access basic education, and in the case of non-national learners, a permit to be required. And so, as mentioned, the court found that unjustifiably limited the right to basic education, because what it meant was that education was provisional or conditional on the provision of documents. What the judgment was also at pains to state was that the right to education extends to everyone within the boundaries of South Africa. That includes children who are undocumented of any nationality, and also children who are irregularly here. And so for the 500,000 estimated undocumented children living in South Africa, the judgment has had a huge effect in respect of ensuring greater access for undocumented children to be able to access education, which is something that they were previously unable to access at all. But the confusion that the Bela amendments could create could have a regressive effect and see all of the gains that we have established in that judgment reversed. So an example of this is that after the judgment was handed down, confusion and discrimination in respect of documentation requirements has remained to a certain extent. So for example, a recent circular that was issued in Gauteng required that school learners that school principals must input into SASAMs the identity numbers of undocumented learners. And there was confusion around whether or not that was the identity numbers of undocumented learners who had IDs and who simply just didn't bring them to school in order to do that process, or whether or not it was undocumented learners who had no identity document. And that was a kind of way for the Department of Education to say, well, get your documents so that we can input them into SASAMs. And so all of that confusion ended up leading to a lot of threats from school principals to remove undocumented learners from school. And in one instance that I'm aware of, the actual removal of a learner from school. And so what we are worried about is that there are a number of issues within Bela that create similar confusion that have those knock-on effects. So to start with, confusion arises from the fact that documents are required. So and I put required in inverted commas there to point out that it's a term that comes from within Bela and something that I want to specifically highlight. And the reason that I want to specifically highlight that is because the use of the term required documents is irregular, inappropriate, potentially incorrect, because in light of the judgment that I just mentioned, no documents are actually required at all in order to access education. And so that is something that could potentially lead to confusion in respect of whether or not learners are entitled to access basic education if they don't have those documents. Then the second thing is that the list of required documents in and of itself is problematic because a lot of them can actually not be obtained. So what Bela does, just to provide a little bit of context, is it creates different categories of children, and then for each category it requires that a specific document or set of documents needs to be provided. And so those categories are South African children, permanent resident children, temporary residents, and then refugees and asylum seekers. And each of those categories need to provide certain documents. So in the case of South African children, for example, a South African birth certificate is required. Then in the case of permanent resident children, a foreign issued birth certificate is required. But the issue here is that sometimes those documents are just children are completely unable to obtain them through no fault of their own and through no lack of trying. To give you an example of why, sometimes South African children are unable to obtain birth certificates because there are a number of requirements within the Births and Deaths Registration Act, which they can't meet, and so they're unable to obtain the documents to then present to the school. Or on the other hand, there are a number of unlawful practices at the Department of Home Affairs that also prevent children from being unable to access those documents and then provide them to school. Then in the case of permanent residents, they are not always able to provide a foreign issue birth certificate, which is something that's required under Bela, because they might formerly have been refugees or stateless persons, and therefore they don't have their foreign issued birth certificate. So the crux of that is that children are unable to provide the required documents, and that could have the effect that they are turned away from school on account of that. And that means that a list of required documents is in itself problematic, exclusionary, and ends up creating barriers, as opposed to streamlining a process of ensuring that all children, regardless of their documentation status, can enter school. Then the other issue in respect of Bela is that the requirements in Bela aren't aligned with the requirements in the draft national admissions policy. So that means that when Bela comes into operation and the draft national admissions policy is no longer a draft, and they're operating simultaneously, what will end up happening is that all of the documentation requirements in the admissions policy will be required in order to attend school. And at the same time, all of the documents within BELA must also be provided in order to be able to obtain access to education. And then another little issue with that is that BELA sets up procedures that say what must happen in the case of a child being unable to provide those documents, and that is referral to the Provincial Intergovernmental Committee. And then on the other hand, the admissions policy sets up a different set of procedures, which is referral to the HOD when the learner is unable to provide their documents. And so you have these parallel processes running at the same time, which is a waste of time, a waste of resources, and very strenuous on the parents and the children involved. Then the next issue we have is the establishment of a national intergovernmental committee and a provincial intergovernmental committee as not being the best solution. And it isn't the best solution to ensuring that documentation is acquired, because in most cases, the real reason that children are unable to obtain documents is not through a lack of trying, but because of real legislative and practical barriers at the Department of Home Affairs that unfortunately the setting up of these kinds of committee are unable to resolve at the systemic level. So to give you an example, if a learner needed to obtain a birth certificate, but they don't meet the requirements in the Births and Deaths Registration Act to get that birth certificate, unfortunately, the Provincial Intergovernmental Committee has its hands tied, because that is what the legislation, the Births and Deaths Registration Act, actually says. And then on the other hand, another issue with the setting up of the intergovernmental committees is that it isn't compliant with POPI, with the Protection of Personal Information Act. And so for that reason, the information that's shared with a host of other departments and is shared automatically and without the consent of parents and all the child's consent ends up actually being immediately unlawful. And then very lastly, the sharing of this information with intergovernmental committees can give rise to the impression that it's created for the purposes of immigration enforcement. So just one thing that gives that impression, and there are more, but I don't have the time within this particular presentation to go through them all. But one example is that the inclusion of the South African Police Services in the committee and the inclusion of the Department of Labour and Employment in the committee doesn't seem to, the nature of their involvement is unclear in how they might obtain documents for children. Then another issue is that although BELA doesn't say that where the learner can't provide the required documents, the child must nonetheless be allowed to attend school, it becomes that allowance or that right of undocumented learners to be able to access school becomes quite lost in the quagmire of documentation lists. The documentation list is at the top of BELA. That is where school staff will be focusing to make sure that children actually obtain those documents. And then much later in BELA, it says, in between a lot of other talk of the national and provincial intergovernmental committees, it says over there that children should be allowed to attend school if they aren't able to provide the documentation. And so it needs to be obviously much clearer. The rights need to be stated much more clearly, and it also needs to be stated upfront before we go into anything else about what documents you should obtain and bring to school, bearing in mind the right that was stated upfront. And then the wording in section 4F, which is the section that states that children can attend school even if they can't provide the required documentation. That wording is unclear because it seems to be applicable only to children who fall into the categories that I mentioned. So it's applicable to permanent resident children who need the following documents. It's applicable to South African children who need the following documents. But there are actually a number of other categories of children living in South Africa. So for example, categories of children who are unaccompanied minors and don't fit into any of the other categories, children of adults who are on exemption permit, so for example ZSP or a Lesotho special permit, and children who are here irregularly. It's not clear what documents they are required to provide and what must happen to them if they're unable to provide those documents, or if they are unable to provide any documents at all. And so that creates confusion as well. And then the last point is criminalization of parents who refuse to cooperate in securing the required documentation. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that in a minute, but suffice it to say for right now, it is problematic and not the best solution. So what we recommend is that firstly, the required documents content in the definition section, which is section 1, and then any reference to it in 4.1a to 1g of BELA must be removed. Because the current admissions policy, read with the Centre for Child Law Judgment, at the moment sufficiently regulates the admission of children to school. It ensures that all of the necessary documents for school administration are provided, and it has over the course of time that we've been able to monitor it, we've seen that it has led to less barriers than how the situation was prior. And every time a new circular comes up talking about undocumented learners, we see confusion arises. And so the clearer that we are about what rights are actually supposed to go into BELA, as opposed to the barriers that children need to overcome in order to access school, the better off we will be. Then documentation requirements shouldn't actually be contained in legislation itself, because that becomes very rigid. But what can be included in legislation is rights. So what is probably more appropriate to do is to ensure that the rights of undocumented learners are contained in legislation. And then to the extent that documentation and more finer detail on the everyday administration of a school, those kinds of things should be inserted into a policy or a guideline. And then the very last thing in respect of our recommendations on undocumented learners is that if the Department of Education feels that it must persist with documentation requirements that it must be contained in legislation, what needs to come up first and foremost is that undocumented children have the right to be able to access education. Then you can go into what documents would be ideal to provide, but if you can't provide them, that's all right. And then those documentation requirements really have to be narrowed down to what is absolutely necessary for school administration, so that it doesn't end up causing barriers for children to access school. So what is necessary for school administration would be something like a birth certificate, if you're able to provide it, but potentially not a foreign issued birth certificate that's very difficult for some permanent residents to obtain, because as I mentioned, if you're a refugee or if you're a stateless person, you don't have access to those documents. Then to move on to criminalization. So several of the amendments that are being introduced in BELA either increase or introduce criminal sanctions for parents and for caregivers. So to just give you two examples of a number of examples within BELA, it's clause 2B and clause 38. Clause 2B criminalizing parents who prevent a child from attending school without a good reason. And then 38 that creates a criminal offense of parents and caregivers who knowingly submit forged or misleading information when applying for admission or fee exemption. And then also in the case of undocumented learners, criminalization if a parent doesn't cooperate with the provincial intergovernmental committee. So the issue there is that, of course, criminalization simply doesn't tackle the underlying issues. And in the end, what the inevitable effect of it is that it will predominantly affect women, who are often the primary caregivers in South Africa. And so criminalization would potentially leave children without caregivers and potentially without their primary caregiver. And then it's in the end a very overly harsh penalty. It's punitive, and it doesn't consider children's best interests. And so our recommendation there would be to ensure that all sections proposing criminalizing parents be removed entirely. Thank you very much.
Now, let me thank the Equal Education and the Equal Education Law Center. No data.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much for the presentation. So the first one is that, I'm going to try to be short. There's like 4 questions that I have. The first one is, what alternative amendment would you then propose on Section 20I, or the South African Schools Act, if you're proposing that that one be completely done away with. It would be interesting to hear that. The second one is trying to understand two components of the proposals around the clauses on the determination of language policies and admissions policies. And there's a statement that specifically says that we demand that those single medium schools be changed to dual medium schools. Did Equal Education or EELC do an analysis of the constitutional breaches that that demand comes with, considering that the Constitution says that where the government is able to provide or implement or give an opportunity to give single medium education where practically possible, they then should do so. And then there's a demand that says, well, we demand that they get rid of them. And did you do an investigation as to what the constitutional implications of that proposal are? And then, do I understand you correctly when you say on 2 points that you support the proposed amendment that, and before I ask the question, there's a difference between decision-making and oversight, right? I approve, I have an oversight role to play in terms of if these policies that are, adopted by the SGB are being utilized to maybe exclude certain learners, then I've got an oversight responsibility to intervene there as an HOD or as an MEC. Decision-making is to say that, well, you determine that this is the policy that you would like to be approved as the SGB, therefore I've got the powers to either approve or disapprove that. So there's a difference between decision-making and oversight, and I hope I'm capturing you correctly. So the question I then have is, by supporting the clauses around saying that the HOD must be given the powers to approve language policies, which is a decision-making process, not an oversight responsibility. An oversight responsibility is where if there is a school that is utilizing those policies to discriminate against certain learners, then that affected individual may then appeal to either the department or the MEC to then intervene to ensure that those policies are actually not utilized to exclude certain learners, because even constitutionally, they're not supposed to do that. So I want to just be clear on whether I understand you to support the decision-making process of that, or are you then saying that the school governing bodies must still retain their powers to determine admissions and language policies? However, there must be an appeal mechanism where if those policies are then utilized to exclude certain learners, then the HOD and the department can then intervene. Or do they then become a player, then a referee at the same time? Do they approve and then they play oversight? So I just want to understand your proposal on that so that I'm very clear. And then there's something that I've quoted here that basically says HODs must, there's more powers that you then advocate for at a later stage. And then you further say that HODs must establish the extent of access from similarly resourced schools. So is the issue here of access based on resource schools or just access generally around schools? And the reason I asked the question, it goes back to the first presentation that was given today, that do parents want to access schools because the schools are available, or they want to access well-resourced schools? And therefore, that's why there's a bone of contention that some of these powers must then be given to the department to kind of impose those learners to those particular schools because they are well-resourced and they've got quality teaching, or they're good schools and so on. Should it not be the other case whereby there must be schools that are actually well-resourced and well-capacitated so that the demand in these well-resourced schools, some of them single medium, some of them dual medium, in fact, in large components of them being dual medium schools. Should then it not be the case that the focus of the laws that is being made here around this be how do we then best capacitate the schools that are actually not well-resourced, that are under demand, that we drive past every day, rather than saying, let's change the policies to access the best schools, which in themselves are limited schools. And then the last question to Equal Education and EELC is, don't you think that the private-public or the public-private partnerships in schools can be a solution in mitigating the challenge of well-resourced schools versus not well-resourced schools? And should that not be a consideration that we take as a committee or parliament to kind of look at what mechanisms should be put in place in law to encourage a public-private partnership so that those schools are actually well-capacitated and well-resourced, rather than relying on a limited number of schools to access a limited number of schools that are actually well-resourced, well-run, and well-governed in this instance. And there's a question that I missed, Chair, sorry. How does Equal Education and EELC recommend addressing admissions policies in single medium schools to mitigate the exclusionary practices while still preserving the benefit of mother tongue education? Thank you so much, Chair.
Honorable Suela.
Well, thank you, Chairperson. I understand the issues around documentation that is required and probably the frustration that some of the learners may not be able to produce the required document, probably because of issues arising from home affairs. But then I understand that that may be causing a problem probably for those that may not be able to provide such documents. However, Clause 38 creates a criminal offense of parents or caregivers who knowingly submit forged or misleading information when applying for admission or fee exemptions. And your overall recommendation, therefore, is that all clauses or sections proposing criminalizing parents be removed entirely. I say that we should have a situation where people submit false documents. We should condone that. Is it my understanding that that should be condoned? I need to be clarified on that, because I thought documentations are required for identification purposes. Can I get a clarity on that?
Honorable at once.
Thank you very much, Chair. And also appreciate the presentation by Equal Education and the EELC, Equal Education Law Center. There's a lot of good work that they are doing that, you know, we see happening all over the country. But when it comes to this specific meeting for today, I would also want to get clarity or their view on the issue of undocumented learners, more especially on the side of the parents. You know, in your presentation, you talk a lot about undocumented learners, but there's no way where you place, you know, the responsibility of their parents, because I strongly believe they did not, you know, land themselves here in South Africa. They came with elderly people, parents or whoever. So maybe I would want to hear your view on what should be their responsibility, as you feel strongly that they must not be, you know, criminalization of, you know, that must be in the bill. So if maybe you can give me clarity on what is your view on what must happen when such cases do arise. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think from my side, let me also just probably say something on this presentation. There is a page on your presentation where you are recommending that the geographical areas that learners attending the single medium school, I don't get to understand what are you actually saying with these geographical areas. What exactly are you saying? Because I'm also interested in understanding what is exactly do you seek to achieve by raising such an issue. And I think both members have raised the issue of documentation, which you kept on raising. And I understand we are dealing with an act here, and you've introduced yourselves as lawyers. You are not going to tell us what these documents are, but I take it that it should be your birth certificate and your immunization certificates. If I'm wrong, you'll be able to correct me when you respond. But my question specific is your organization. What is it that you have done to try to solve the problem? Because you were identified as the problem. And obviously the fact that you keep on raising it, it concerns you as an organization. So what is it that you have done, except for the question that my colleague has asked about the parents, but yourself as an organization? And I'm interested in knowing, what is your developmental agenda? What's your organizational developmental agenda? Because I mean, the two organizations that I speak, I've got at a personal level, I do have an understanding of who they are and what is it that they deal with. And I want, or rather, be given an opportunity to understand, on top of what is your development agenda, where is your funding coming from? Who funds your organization? Because I think it's important that we understand what is it that we are dealing with at this level as well. So those are the issues for myself, from me, that I would really want to understand from yourselves. Advocate Misa, do you have anything to say?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chairperson, just on two issues, the issue of alcohol that was raised, just to set the record straight and to indicate that I think it is abundantly clear in the Bella Bill that no person may bring liquor into the public school premises or have liquor in his or her possession or continue to sell liquor on public premises or during any public school activity. The chances of learners coming into contact with alcohol outside the school premises is far greater than within the school premises, even with the provisions as they are. I must also hasten to add that our minister supports a zero tolerance against alcohol at schools. But we cannot deny that in many schools, these activities involving alcohol are occurring, and that we must therefore find a way in terms of which to regulate it. I mean, during when they have fundraising activities, sometimes you have a beer garden, we let out our school halls for church services, etc. You have wine at weddings, alcohol, etc. So we are attempting to regulate the possession, consumption, and sale of alcohol at schools. We are not saying that we are allowing this because we want to give learners better access to liquor or alcohol at schools. That's incorrect. We are trying to prevent this. And that's the reason for regulating, so that when or if there is an occasion for a school to have alcohol on the premises, that it is regulated properly, that learners are kept away from it, and that it is managed properly so that they are protected. And indeed, we do acknowledge and appreciate the social ills associated with alcohol, but we felt that this was important to have it in the bill so that the instances where alcohol is consumed in the school premises or on the school premises is regulated properly. Chairperson, with regards to the issue of documents, I think we are on the same side. When it comes to documentation, what the Bella Bill is trying to do is to ensure that we have learners that are documented, so that the provisions that have been inserted, including the national the mechanisms that have been provided of the national committee as well as intergovernmental committee, is to try to assist parents who do not have documents for their learners to get the documents. We cannot have a country where we have people living in without documentation. And hence we are saying, let's try to find a middle line. Let's try and find a more effective way of getting government departments to work together, particularly with the Department of Home Affairs, ensure that our learners get the documents that they require so that they are documented within the country. So thank you very much, Chairperson. Those are the two issues that I wanted to pick on.
Chair, could I maybe just still ask a question this side?
Oh,
I was just out for a moment and the moment became a little bit longer than I anticipated. I'll limit to what I heard when I was still in the room. It was clear from the presentation of equal education that you have a much more statist, meaning an ideology centered around the state, especially regarding education, than the previous two presentations. And I would like to know from you, how would you distinguish, or where would you draw the line between the responsibilities of the state and the community? Or to ask you differently, if what you say in terms of the school governing body is an actual, let's say, the truth or the way it should be, where should the community's involvement come in? Thank you. You should recognize, Honorable Chair, that when I say I'm going to brief, I am brief.
Thank you very much. You can respond, both of you.
Thank you so much, honorable members. I will try also to make my answers as brief as possible. Regarding Honorable Nodada's questions, firstly, the alternative recommendations for 20I. The specific recommendations are listed in our submission. However, some brief ones that I can pull up for you now include, for example, avenues, whether it be a hotline or increased protection for whistleblowers, so that there's increased accountability while keeping school governing bodies' involvement, also ensuring that there is the ability and here directly to come to your thing of oversight versus decision-making power, to increase the oversight rather than bringing in just the decision-making power of the provincial education departments. Other issues which obviously speak to broader issues than just the Bella Bill and are around state capacity and ensuring that we have fully capacitated provincial education departments, and also ensuring that there isn't corruption and malpractice at the state level, that they can adequately provide oversight. I can quickly go through and look at the exact recommendations in a second, but maybe I'll just answer your other questions that I have easily available. Regarding the second question around the constitutionality of changing single medium schools to dual medium schools. Am I correct that that was the question? In this regard, I think the position that equal education is coming from, and which I'm sure we can all agree, the Constitution is a document that requires a balancing of rights. And what we have here is the right to be taught in the language of your choice, the right to those rights around cultural and religious freedoms. But on the other hand is obviously the right to basic education. And we really believe that in this instance, it is to say that in a situation in which all learners were able to access fully well-resourced schools that taught solely in their preferred language, that would obviously be the ideal situation that we would find ourselves in. We are not saying that as a principle, schools should be dual medium. We're simply looking at the reality of what we're facing, which is that we have learners who are unable to gain access to adequate schools, and in some cases, schools at all. And on the other hand, we have undercapacitated schools that are single medium schools and have the ability to prevent learners from attending those schools on the basis of language. Now, we believe, as I'm sure everyone would agree, public schools as an entirety are a public good and should be both equally shared in and should equally be the burden of all of us. It cannot be that some public schools with better resources are able to keep their admission rates down, are able to fight overcrowding, are able to have good resources, and that the implications of that is that other learners must simply accept that they must attend overcrowded schools and that they cannot access schools that are close to them purely because this right to this other constitutional right must somehow take preference over that. So the ideal situation that we're all sitting with is obviously that all learners are taught in schools that provide education in their language preference. However, what we are sitting with, and I think this speaks to a little bit of number 3, which I will also come to, is the fact that we have found, and this is also the reason that we are calling for higher degree of decision making by the HOD, not just oversight, is that we have seen that there are a number of schools across multiple provinces that have been able to exclude learners from admission based on language policies. Now, obviously, ideally, there could be an oversight role from the head of department, but they wouldn't necessarily need to step in to remedy a school's language policy. Ideally, you will have communities that are able to make these decisions for themselves. You would be able to have communities decide their needs. However, we have seen across the country that certain portions of certain communities, let's say schools, have not done this. They have created schools that exclude learners from the area, that create overcrowding in other schools versus, undercapacity in their schools because of language policies. And in those instances, we don't believe that it is simply that should simply be allowed to stand. If we were in a situation where we were finding this, then there would be no need for the head of departments to be actively involved. However, we are seeing this, and this hasn't been remedied at a community level and at the school level. And so in light of that, it is needed that there's not just an oversight capacity, because that puts the burdens on learners and communities and parents to constantly fight for access to schools. What we are saying is we need the head of departments to be actively involved, not just react when they realize there's a problem, but actively involved to ensure that these language problems don't arise. Because, learners can raise issues, although that is important and that is part of, the constitutional democratic environment. What if that takes 6 months to resolve? That's 6 months of a learner's year. And that is something that deeply concerns us. And I think I touched on the third question regarding decision-making versus oversight. Unfortunately, we need immediate and up-to-date interventions by the head of the department. We need to make sure